What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. Alright, so in this video, I want to talk about a player that was probably the closest thing we've seen to Russell Westbrook during his era, and that is Steve Francis. Stevie franchise, as he was known, especially during his first stint with the Houston Rockets, when he looked to be destined to be a Hall of Fame caliber player. But, you know, certain things developed that ultimately robbed him of that distinction. Falling out of favor with coaches, falling out of favor with the NBA in a lot of ways, and ultimately injuries. But I'm going to tell you something, there's always been this thing, starting in the major media era, well, there's always been this guy, whether it's Steve Francis or Carmelo Anthony or Russell Westbrook or whoever, or Allen Iverson. It's like there's always this guy that the media like to rag on. You know, the media needs somebody to play the villain. And, you know, for a while, you could argue Steve Francis was that guy. And when I say you can compare him to Russell Westbrook, I mean this. He was an exciting player, athletic. They're about the same size, 6'3", 210. Of course, Russell Westbrook, his career far surpasses Steve Francis, as well as his accomplishments. And but, you know, for a while, Steve Francis was that dude, man. When he was drafted in 1999, he had a very exciting upswing as far as his game is concerned, potential. Already, he was a great scorer. Now, remember back in those days, if you averaged 20 points a game, that was a great scorer because, you know, look, teams weren't scoring 115 points a game back then. Matter of fact, teams weren't even scoring 100 points back then. So if you're averaging 20 points a game coming into the league, you were a deadly scorer because the game was slower paced back then. But this guy was very exciting, man. He had a great crossover dribble. He was a great driver of the basketball, rim rattling dunks, exciting. And when he got going, he could carry a team. You know what I'm saying? He could win a ball game for you. The problems with him, he was not a great outside shooter. And this is where it's going to sound similar to Russell Westbrook. He turned the ball over too much. He could be very careless with the basketball. And that was probably the biggest knock on him basketball-wise. And sometimes people question his basketball IQ. So that sounds very familiar, right? But anyway, this guy had a very, very tough start to his life, man. All right, he was born in 1977, and his family was extremely affected by poverty and the crack epidemic of the 80s going into the 90s. He was born in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and as young as age 10, he began working with drug dealers. At age 10, started selling cocaine as a teenager. And while he displayed a supreme talent for basketball, when his mother passed away of cancer when he was about 18 years old, he stopped playing basketball temporarily. And the last few years of his teenage years, he lived with his grandmother and relatives in an apartment where 18 people lived. So I'm talking about, you know, this guy lived in a fucked up situation, man. Was living on food stamps. The biggest break of his life came after he dropped out of high school. He dropped out of high school at age 18. Like I said, after his mother died, he was severely depressed, didn't give a fuck. doing what he was doing on the streets. But the biggest break of his life came when he received an offer to play college basketball for San Trentino College after he was noticed at an AAU tournament. And, you know, he was, like I said, he stood out like a sore thumb at that tournament. And anyway, he attended San Jacinto College in 1996 and 1997, and the Allegheny College of Maryland in 1997, 1998. And afterwards, I think it was during his junior year, he transferred to Maryland to play for the Maryland Terrapins. And, you know, he was a star playing with them. And he had them, he led them to a very high seed where they went 28-6 during his junior year playing there. And they finished second in the ACC. And he was named to the All-ACC First Team and the All-ACC Tournament Team. Now, during his junior year going into what would have been his senior year in college, he said that he was going to continue to play for Maryland, but ultimately he opted to go pro, and he entered the 1999 NBA draft. Now, this is a very important time in the NBA. This was not long after Michael Jordan retired from basketball. This was after a lot of great players from the 80s and 90s were either retiring or near the very end of their careers. Clyde Drexler had retired. Magic Johnson had retired for good back in 96. Bird and Magic had retired long ago. But even just the lower tier guys, you know what I'm saying? Like Ricky Pierce, I think, retired after 98. You know, a lot of these other guys, like, were near the end of their careers, or they were near the end of their primes. Dominique Wilkins retired after 99. So, you get what I'm trying to say. But anyway, Steve Francis was selected second in that draft by the Vancouver Grizzlies. Back then they were in Vancouver. He did not want to play there. He was adamant about not wanting to play in Vancouver. So just before the start of the 1999-2000 season, Francis was traded to the Houston Rockets in what was at the time the largest trade in NBA history. And he was traded to the Houston Rockets. And this was a very interesting time for Houston, the 99-2000 season. This was a transitionary period. Clyde Drexler had retired, as I said before. Charles Barkley was pretty much done. Charles Barkley had, that was going to be his last year. He wound up only playing, a handful of games that year. He suffered a career-ending injury, but he was able to come back and play the last game of that season for the Rockets. But all in all, he was done. And even Elijah Wan was on the downside of his career. I can't remember off the top of my head what he was averaging, but it probably was something like around 14 points and maybe 8 rebounds or something. He was not the same guy. So Steve Francis was going to lead this franchise. And he shared Rookie of the Year honors with Elton Brand. And during his rookie year, Steve Francis averaged, 18 points. Now keep in mind, we're talking about the 1999-2000 season, so scoring was way down compared to today. So you have to make adjustments to what this would be today. Like, this would probably be like averaging 24, 25 points per game today. So anyway, he averaged 18 points, 5.3 rebounds, 6.6 assists, 1.5 steals, 44.5% shooting from the floor, 34.5% from beyond the arc, and 78.6% from the charity stripe. When you look at the rebounds and assists, what would that be today? Like maybe 7 rebounds and 8.6 assists. It's not too far off Westbrook, you know. So you can definitely see a comparison there, as far as numbers at least. But the team only finished with a 34-48 record. The next season, I believe 2000-2001 season, the Rockets improved to 45-37, but they still missed the playoffs. I do want to also mention that Steve Francis participated in the 2000 Slam Dunk Contest, and he finished as a runner-up to Vince Carter. But, I mean, if you ever watched that contest, man, it really was no contest. I mean, Vince Carter just completely, I mean, that's one of the most runaway landslide performances you ever seen in a slam dunk contest. But anyway, in his third season, Steve Francis became an all-star, but ended up only playing 55 games due to injuries. And as a result, the Rockets posted a terrible 28-54 record, landing them in the lottery, where they were able to acquire Yao Ming with the first pick in the 2002 NBA draft. So initially, Yao Ming was teamed up with Steve Francis and not Tracy McGrady as we tend to remember it. But their first season together, both were selected for the 2003 NBA All-Star Game. They went 43-39 that year, however, still missing the playoffs, which goes to show you how stacked the Western Conference was. During that time period, because a 43-39 record would have easily gotten you into the playoffs in the Eastern Conference back during that time period. During 2003, I think during the offseason, Rockets head coach Rudy Tomjanovich, longtime head coach, stepped down, and the team selected former New York Knicks coach Jeff Van Gundy as his successor. Now, this would be the beginning of the end of superstar or all-star Steve Francis, because his coaching style, Van Gundy's, did not match well with Steve Francis' style of play. Okay? They also just didn't get along with each other from a personality standpoint. So even though Francis made the All-Star game for the third straight year, his numbers began to decline, going from 21 points, 6.2 rebounds, and 6.2 assists to 16.6 points, 5.5 rebounds, and 6.2 assists per contest. The Rockets, however, did make the playoffs for the first time since 1999. Matter of fact, it's the only playoff appearance that Steve Francis made in his career. In that series, they faced the Lakers. So this would be the 2004 Lakers, the team that had Karl Malone, Gary Payton, Kobe, and Shaq. Despite the fact that in that series, Steve Francis averaged over 19 points, over 8 rebounds, and 7.6 assists per game, the Rockets lost to the Lakers in 5 games. The relationship between Steve Francis and Jeff Van Gundy began to further deteriorate, and at that point, a trade was imminent. And in 2004, the Rockets traded Steve Francis to the Orlando Magic, basically in exchange for Tracy McGrady. The actual trade was Steve Francis, Cuttino Mobley, and Kelvin Cato. Remember him, Kelvin Cato? For Tracy McGrady, Juwan Howard, Tyronn Lue. Yep, Tyronn Lue was a player, and Reese Gaines. All right, during Francis' first year with the Orlando Magic, he flourished. He averaged 21.3 points, 5.8 rebounds, and 7 assists. And they initially started off well, but then slumped and then missed the playoffs. And that was pretty much Steve Francis, man. I mean, he was an exciting player to watch individually, but his style of play did not translate to team success. You could argue, hey, he didn't have another superstar, but he did have another superstar with Yao Ming, and they still were a middling team. Now, it's interesting that when Tracy McGrady is added to the mix, they did become at least a playoff team, although they weren't able to get out of the first round, but still, with Tracy McGrady was able to go to the playoffs. 2005-2006 season, Steve Francis began to show his ass, and the Orlando Magic began to fine him and suspend him for conduct detrimental to the team. And ultimately, he was traded to the New York Knicks. By this time, he was having issues physically with tendonitis and other issues, which eventually was going to rob him of the speed and explosiveness that he had coming into the NBA. After a year with the New York Knicks, he then returned to the Houston Rockets, 2007-2008, and he then went. I think he played 1 year with the Rockets. Then he was traded early on, beginning the next season, to the Memphis Grizzlies. The Grizzlies now were in Memphis, but ultimately he never played for them. He was waived. And then he went over and played with the Beijing Ducks in China, flamed out over there, and that was pretty much it, man. And Steve Francis just disappeared from the face of the fucking earth. And, he had a couple of incidents, off the court. I don't want to really mention all that. I'm not Malika Andrews. It's not important to the video. But, man, it's just, when you saw Steve Francis playing for the Houston Rockets, man, you had an idea that this guy was going to be a superstar. You really did. But ultimately, it wasn't in the cards. During his first tenure with the Houston Rockets, he averaged over 19 points a game. All right? He averaged over 19 points a game, 6 rebounds. Matter of fact, 19.3 points per game, 6.1 rebounds, 6.4 assists, 1.6 steals, 43% shooting from the floor, 34.6% from three-point range, and 79% from the foul line. And, like I said, man, he put up the numbers, but he just couldn't quite lead his team to playoff success. They couldn't build upon anything when Steve Francis was there. Plus, like I said, over time, his level of play did not justify some of the tensions that he caused the team or the organization. And ultimately, if you get a bad reputation, the NBA will blackball you out of the league. And that's exactly what happened to Steve Francis. But for a brief period of time, man, this guy was exciting to watch. But tell me what you guys think.